Hi, everyone. My name is Monte Solberg, Principal of New West Public Affairs. Welcome to Alberta Look Ahead 2021. Our time today is short, so let's get right to it. We'll begin by introducing our panel. With us today, Sonia Kont. Give us a wave, Sonia. Kurdish by birth, Calgarian by choice, and a dynamic grassroots fundraiser and campaigner for the United Conservative Party when she's not busy as a terrific young consultant for New West Public Affairs. We have Matt Solberg, former Wild Rose staffer and Director of Communications for Jason Kenney in the last election campaign, now, of course, consulting with New West. Another member of the New West team, Keith McLaughlin, former Chief of Staff in the Rachel Notley government, and former staffer in the Stephen Harper government, now applying his skills at New West Public Affairs, Michael Solberg. None of this would be possible without our partners and friends at Earnscliffe Strategy Group. A big shout out to Charles Bird and to Yaroslav Baran for their help in organizing this today. To our audience, welcome. And if you have questions, we invite you to put them in the Q&A box, which you'll find on your screen, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. So make sure you fire some questions off to us. Right now, we're going to get underway, and we'll start with a snapshot of Alberta attitudes and opinions from Earnscliffe pollster Doug Anderson. Doug, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me on this. Just want to share a few things that we've been discovering about public opinion in Alberta, and how it maybe relates to or compares with what we see nationally. What we've done is two waves of study, two surveys, one in May, which was just around the time that the curve of daily reported cases of COVID was starting to flatten. It hadn't really started to come down yet. And we went back into field again mid to late October, and that was in the middle of what has been this upward trajectory of daily cases. And I raise that because I think the context of when we were doing these two waves of study is actually, it's relevant because Canadians' opinions do tend to alter based on how things are unfolding. What I wanted to share was, a few different things that I think are of interest, obviously, to the Alberta public, people concerned with Alberta issues. There are plenty of ways in which the results of our surveys in Alberta only differ slightly from results we find nationally. COVID, both waves, remains the top concern, although maybe a little bit less acute when we did it in October than what we found in May. Again, that might not be the case if we go back in the field today, but it seems to have been dialed down ever so slightly over that time. Everywhere, the economy was a distant second in terms of the issue that people felt was of greatest concern to them. But notably, Albertans are twice as likely as everyone else to name that as actually the issue of greatest concern to them. The public acceptance of basic measures such as continuing physical distancing or limiting the size of gatherings, now pretty widespread, both in Alberta and nationally. Making masks mandatory, it's now actually supported by 64% in Alberta, and that, like everywhere else, is a dramatic increase from what we found in May. In May, 35% in Alberta were supporting it, so it's basically doubled, and the compass has shifted on support for that kind of measure. But the idea of things like mandatory vaccines, still controversial. That said, there's actually now more support than opposition to that. Again, whether we're talking about Alberta or nationally, the same is true. One other thing that we're monitoring, and it looks like it's become actually kind of important for understanding opinion broadly. It's the anguish that people are feeling these days. We ask questions on whether people have been impacted by COVID, either in a major way, minor way, or not at all, both in terms of themselves just personally and in terms of their financial well-being. And what we found was something rather striking, that about 1 in 4 Canadians say they have had a major impact, both personally and financially, as a result of COVID. And that proportion in Alberta is higher than the rest of the country. It's 28% in Alberta, whereas it's 23% everywhere else. Basically, our data shows that there's a heightened sense of vulnerability, like everywhere, but perhaps it's even more pronounced in Alberta. Our study covered a lot of things, and plenty of ink has already been used to talk about performance ratings of governments and other key players in dealing with the pandemic. Ours covered that, of course. However, we went beyond the beauty pageant and investigated a variety of specific issues, including things like what to do about long-term care facilities. But the one thing that I want to focus on for the next minute or two is the pressing issue of vaccines and the challenge faced everywhere, which is getting enough people vaccinated in order to achieve that herd level of immunity that everyone says is so critical. In Alberta, as everywhere else, the majority are saying that they are actually likely to get vaccinated. That measure we've found in Alberta, as I say, mid to late October, was 63%, which was not all that different from the 67% we found elsewhere. What appears to be the most challenging thing, and people have talked about this in all kinds of stories, there's been a lot of other researchers have released data on this, as people have probably seen, is that there's a high level of concern about the safety of the vaccine. And it does hold true in Alberta, as it does in the rest of Canada, that there are a majority who are at least somewhat concerned about the safety of the vaccine. And the way we tested it was the safety of a vaccine approved for use in Canada by Health Canada. So we were making sure that people weren't thinking we're talking about just any vaccine or the Russian vaccine or something like that. And there's a tendency to think that this level of concern about the safety of the vaccine must be what's limiting the level of intent to get vaccinated. That's an intuitive and tempting conclusion to draw. But our data show there's actually very little correlation between concern and vaccine intention. It's really only the few people who say they are very concerned with the safety of the vaccine who are generally disinclined to get vaccinated. Among the large segment who say they are somewhat concerned, 71% still say they're going to get vaccinated. So concern may be a factor, but it's not the determining one. So we created a segmentation, sorting people into 4 categories. We're finding similar results everywhere. But if anything, the results are maybe slightly more challenging in Alberta. First of all, there's a segment of those who are not concerned about the safety of the vaccine and intend to get vaccinated. That's 27% of Albertans, 29% elsewhere, roughly the same. The next segment is those who are concerned about the vaccine, but still intend to get vaccinated. That's 38% in Alberta. It's 40% everywhere else. So again, roughly the same. Then there's the next biggest segment is those who are not concerned about the safety of the vaccine, but still say they're not likely to get vaccinated. In Alberta, that measure is 31% of the population. That's 27% elsewhere. So it's now a little bit higher in Alberta, as you can see. And the remaining are a very tiny fraction who say they're concerned about vaccine safety and do not intend to get vaccinated. It's only 3% in Alberta, 4% in the rest of the country. So that particular aspect suggests that it's not really the concern itself that's driving whether or not to get vaccinated. And the interesting things about this is what we're finding is there's a stronger correlation to that sense of financial vulnerability. The people who are holding this challenging combination of I'm not concerned about the safety, but I'm not likely to get vaccinated. They have a number of skews that are really interesting. And I think from a public policy and communications perspective within Alberta, it's worth bearing in mind. They are more likely to say the economy is the biggest concern. They're more likely to be employed, either self-employed or part-time or unemployed. So they don't necessarily have that confidence that's given by having a full-time employment by an employer. They're more likely to live in rural areas. They feel they've been impacted in a major way financially. basically people who are saying the whole thing has been overblown, which was a specific measure we did ask. And they're critical of the performance of government at every level that we offer. So, they're critical of federal government, they're critical of provincial government, they're critical of municipal government. They also are the people least likely to be paying attention to news or announcements related to COVID. So to put it simply, what we're finding is the status of the relationship between these people who need to be encouraged as much as possible to get vaccinated and who aren't particularly nervous about the safety of it. And the health officials and others who might be communicating with it, it's a complicated relationship. The study didn't really delve into the communication solutions, but the strategic implication is basically that if you want to convince those people who are relatively unmotivated to get vaccinated to go and do so, the messages about how serious a crisis we're facing are unlikely to be the ones that resonate or convince them. Similarly, there are probably some messengers who are going to have much greater difficulty in being heard than others. So the key to motivating that change, that's one of the most pressing needs everywhere across the country really, is maybe placing it in the context of addressing what's truly frightening them, their sense of financial vulnerability. So if things can be, if it's positioned that, well, health is more important right now than dealing with the economy, those messages probably aren't going to get through to those particular people. It's already working on everybody else. So for this segment, they need to hear something else. They need to hear that their financial vulnerability is being addressed, or have a credible spokesperson delivering a case for how vaccines address both that vulnerability and the public health issues at once.
Doug, thanks very much. We appreciate that. Panel, you've heard what Doug has said. Lots of people feeling vulnerable. Alberta's unemployment rate about 11.5% compared to the national average of 8.5%. So it's not super surprising. We're going to look ahead a bit now to 2021. Matt, why don't you lead us off and reflect on what Doug has told us. There's all kinds of policy initiatives underway from the provincial government right now. Some reaction to the federal government. And then we'll get Sonia to maybe talk a little bit about the politics. Doug, thanks very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So on the COVID front, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. As has been reported widely, Alberta started vaccinating the first health professionals 2 days ago. They're expecting to vaccinate close to 30,000 by the end of this year before moving into the sort of the wider population by Q1 of next year. So the challenges ahead will be great. Convincing a large enough proportion of the population to go and get vaccinated will be an effort that the Premier and the government of Alberta as a whole will need to undertake. But at the same time, the economy being, if not one of the top issues in the minds of Albertans, means that the province needs to go and focus on economic growth. And we're expecting to see the investment and growth strategies unveiled in this next year. Other incentives to see economic activity increase, and frankly, tackle diversification in a way that we haven't seen yet so far. There's a lot of opportunities ahead for the province, and I think that the government's not putting COVID in the rearview mirror, but they certainly are preparing for the post-COVID future, which we expect to see relatively quickly in 2021.
Sonia, you keep your ear to the ground. Tell us what you're hearing from your sources about how the government is looking at the year ahead. Are people optimistic? Is there some concern? I'm sure it's some kind of a mix of both.
Yeah, and thank you, Monty. And you are right, there's going to be a mix of both, good and bad. But I think for the government of Alberta in 2021, they're really going to have to focus on economic recovery. I think the government has done a good job of providing, grants and support for small businesses in particular. Just weeks ago, we saw that the government was focusing on also supporting communities, cultural and worship places with supports for them as well. But we have to understand that Premier Kenney and his government are about 65% to 70% done of their UCP platform. I think that's pretty incredible considering it's only been 2 years. I think the government of Alberta is really going to focus on some of the good feel policies that maybe perhaps a lot of Albertans can get behind, even maybe the NDP, a lot of focus on red tape reduction, which will go into hopefully the economic recovery aspect as well. But, an election's coming soon. They're halfway there. What I'm hearing from the ground from the MLAs is they're hoping to be in their ridings a bit more. I think their constituents would want to see them face to face. MLAs have been in the legislature until 4 a.m. sometimes. It's been absolutely brutal. But especially in rural Alberta, constituents want to see their MLAs and representatives face to face. I'm sure a lot of the caucus members are going to really push for that, especially when an election is coming.
Right. So let's move on a little bit here. Premier Kenney is a workhorse. We know that he has a very ambitious agenda, and I would say it's fair to say that Rachel Notley has been his equal. She's been very tough in the legislature, and the NDP support has grown. It's been a tough year politically. It's been a tough year for Albertans, but nothing's going to matter like getting people back to work. The first chance to probably really do that will be Budget 2021. And I'm going to call on Michael now to comment on Budget 2021 and what the government is going to do and needs to do.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dad. So, we just finished the public consultation period for Budget 2021. It's probably mostly cooked at this point. And I think what I'm most interested in seeing is what is the founding kind of principle or guiding principle with which this budget is built on. So we know that the McKinnon report and its conclusions that the government was spending inefficiently compared to other jurisdictions, spending too much for worse outcomes than other provinces. That was the principle of the budget budgets that we've seen previous. The premier was elected on a mandate to balance the budget, and he had carefully crafted a path back to balance through reduced spending year over year. That has been completely obliterated. That reality is long gone. And as a result of COVID and a collapse in the price of oil and kind of the Saudi-Russia price war and a number of things. So what I'm looking to see is how the government pivots, where we no longer can rely on kind of a predictable reduction in spending and like I said, this carefully curated path back to balance. So what is he going to do next? So I think this budget will have absolutely reflect the province's desire to get people back to work. He's going to make enormous investments, and I think in infrastructure, in communities, and projects that will attract investment back into the province and create jobs. And I guess longer term, I'm looking to see how the budget sets the path forward for what he would like to be reelected on in 2023. What is his message going to be to Albertans by then? And what record is he going to be able to look back upon since his initial plan was kiboshed by this horrible virus and this pandemic that we've been under now for the better part of 8 months?
No question that that Budget 2021 is critical, and the government needs to get it right because it does set the tone for the next 2 years. Keith McLaughlin, what's your views on what the government needs to do with the budget?
Well, I'll answer it in kind of what I'm really interested in looking at, or what I find is going to be an interesting piece of this budget, and that's actually taxes and tax increases. I disagree that any government in the past 15, 20 years has actually had a critical path to balance. Alberta has a structural deficit. And that deficit cannot be overcome by spending reductions alone. You just can't do it. The math doesn't work without causing an unrealistic amount of chaos in healthcare and education in particular. So that's the first reason why I'm looking at the tax increases. The second reason why I'm looking at it is because there's probably, and I understand the economy is frail, but there's probably not a better time politically to do it. Because as Sonia mentioned earlier, we're 2 years out from an election. You probably don't want to be doing that in 2022, definitely not in 2023. When I talk about tax increases, I'm not talking about a PST. That's not going to be introduced by this government or heavily contemplated. What I think excuse me, what I'm looking for is go back to the apprentice budget. Go back to some of the fees increases there and other things that you saw there, particularly healthcare premiums. This is a piece that can give the government, depending on how it's structured, about $1.5 billion, perhaps up to $2 billion a year in new revenue. You're going to need it. I think there'll be that discussion because I know that finance and Treasury Board officials well aware about this structural deficit. The minister is well aware. We will see whether or not the UCP does any big moves here. I think that's the low-hanging fruit. We've seen it try to be introduced by a conservative government under the former Premier Prentice. That's the big ticket tax item that I'm looking to see if it gets introduced.
All right, Matt, your response to that?
No, well, I think Minister Taves has already made it clear that if they're going to look at increasing taxes or creating new revenue, they want to have a look at the revenue mix overall. So just like they created the Blue Ribbon panel led by Janice McKinnon to investigate government expenses, I expect that there will be some efforts to do the same on the revenue side to determine what is the best mix of taxation that they can come forward with that would not stunt economic growth, that would not send a signal to the investment community that there's been a change in approach. We know that this government has placed great importance on a low tax environment for business. I expect that to continue. But I do think that there will be a lot on the table in this coming budget, and frankly, every budget between now and the next election. Things that will be on the table that would never have been had it not been for the COVID pandemic and the global decline in energy pricing.
So I just want to frame things a little bit because we do have a new pipeline coming online or being substantially expanded, Line 3, which will mean oil moving through from Alberta down through Minnesota and into the US, another 760,000 barrels a day. We see the price of oil rising. We see the rig count going up pretty much every week. These are the kinds of numbers we follow in Alberta because it's so central to our economy. Sonia, any thoughts on budget 2021 and how MLAs and political staffers are viewing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Monty. I'm interested to see how the ministers of each departments are going to look at the budget, whether they have any creative ideas in terms of reducing, I guess, their spending or removing red tape. I think that's going to be absolutely critical if Premier Kenney wants to reach his goal of cutting a third of the red tape. And I expect ministers and perhaps some of the MLAs to also support the government and support Minister Taves on the budget in terms of reducing spending in areas and different departments. So I'm going to look out for that. I think a lot of the ministers and Premier Kenney's cabinet and caucus are very ambitious. I think they're also going to be pressured by Mr. Taves and the Premier himself to find ways to cut spending. It's more critical than ever right now.
It's a good point. The McKinnon report is really a foundational document. And just to remind our audience, the McKinnon report is something produced by former finance minister in Alberta, or pardon me, in Saskatchewan, Janice McKinnon, an NDP finance minister, but she recommended deep cuts. She noted that Alberta spends much more per capita than any other province when it comes to public services. And she did recommend finding ways to deliver public services through the private sector. And so I think Sonia is probably on the right track. I think we'll see a lot of pressure on ministers to produce ideas on how to do that. Let's switch gears now. Something that's been really big in the news in the last little while has been climate and energy. This fall, the government released its natural gas strategy, which was very ambitious. Government announced a number of sort of tentacles that sort of came from that. That was on top of the government's climate plan, where they brought in their tier regulations and talked about how they would reduce emissions from heavy emitters. Since then, we've seen the federal government's climate plan, we've seen their hydrogen strategy, and now we're waiting for their small and medium reactor, small modular reactor, plan, which we expect on Friday. So all of these things have a huge impact on Alberta's energy sector. So Keith, I'm going to turn it over to you now to reflect a little bit on that and talk about the ambition, the potential for this to get taken up and really change the Alberta economy.
Well, the ambition amongst at the government of Alberta is coming in spades. There's always talk in Alberta about broader economic diversification, and we're talking about tech and all these other things. What this government is really doing as well, in addition to a number of strategies to address those items, is energy diversification within our traditional oil and natural gas industries. So you mentioned a number of these things, the natural gas strategy, and there's a number of other items that are in play with that. But it's a real industrial policy and a real industrial strategy that you're seeing being implemented. And of course, there's a lot to do with the federal government on this, because this is all wrapped up into driving down emissions, net zero 2050, all of these issues. So just maybe I'll make two real quick points. The hydrogen strategy released yesterday, good news for Alberta, and there's an item left outstanding. The good news is the hydrogen strategy, I think, correctly identified that the best pathway to build hydrogen into an industry right now is through natural gas. Remember, hydrogen is a fuel carrier. It's an energy carrier. It's not energy in itself. You have to produce it from another form of energy. Over time, renewables is going to become more cost competitive. But right now, in the next 5 to 7 years, hydrogen or natural gas is the most cost competitive way to produce hydrogen in Canada. That is good news for Alberta. What's outstanding and what's missing is the public investment. There was not money announced yesterday. There was a promise that there could be money, but there needs to be about 5 to 7 billion in terms of a combination of public and private investment to get this going. And I would argue that the federal government does have a responsibility to support Alberta in particular in terms of its industrial strategy with federal dollars to help move these things off the ground. Quickly on the climate plan, I would just say, and I'm sure we'll get back to this, $170 carbon price may not be a bad thing for Alberta in the long run. Having a carbon price like that actually helps us, I would argue, on the ESG file. And there's a number of other carve-outs when we're talking about how there are trade-exposed industries are protected, how consumers are protected, how farmers are protected. This will be a political fight. We'll fight a federal election on it, I'm sure, but it's not that bad news, I would say, if you're looking at it objectively from the Alberta perspective.
Well, that's pretty provocative. Somebody saying a carbon tax in Alberta is a good thing. As we know, conservative governments of all stripes have demonized carbon tax. Looks like we're going there. The government of Alberta reacted quite quickly and condemned it. But there's no question that it could be a bit of a bargaining chip when it comes to things like Keystone XL, which is one of several important and I will say binary decisions that the government of Alberta has made in the last year that are a bit of that carry some risk with them. Certainly Keystone XL carries some risk, but a lot of the government strategies do as it tries to jumpstart the Alberta economy and get things going again after not just COVID-19, but a sort of a worldwide attitude turning away from oil and gas and toward renewable fuels and lower carbon emitting energy. So let's sort of get the discussion going here. Matt, your reaction to all of this, and then we'll go around the table.
Well, I think that, you know, you're right. I think that the investment into Keystone and the backstop that was provided in February was a clear signal that you know, this government is shifting from just focusing on economy-wide measures like lowering the corporate income tax rate and you know, cutting red tape, to now including direct investments in areas that they think will pay off. It is a big gamble, it's a risk, but when it comes to a important sign of health for our energy sector, I think Keystone represents that. But beyond that, they've been looking at incentivizing other sectors as well. And Minister Doug Schweitzer, the Minister for Jobs, Economy and Innovation, has really seized himself with identifying sectors that are ripe for growth. They've been looking, you know, at our energy, agriculture and tourism sectors as sort of the principal drivers for the economy. But beyond that, you know, they're looking at everything from tech and aviation and aerospace as areas to grow. And I think we'll see a lot more focus on some of the non-traditional sectors in the next year as government looks for some good news stories to tell. And Alberta's tech sector right now is full of them.
So let's come back to the tech sector in a minute. There's some good news actually today in Calgary Herald talking about developments in tech, but let's continue on talking about hydrogen, the potential there, natural gas, plastics recycling, LNG. There's just so many things that are going on. Sonia, I'm curious to know what you're hearing regarding 2021 and, you know, whether or not there's optimism amongst political activists in Alberta about what can come out of this natural gas strategy and some of the new opportunities.
I think there's a lot of people are optimistic, Monty, about the future of not just this industry, the LNG, the hydrogen, etc., but just diversification in general. And you've seen Minister Doug Schweitzer really capitalize on this. Most of his comms has really been on diversification. I've seen MLAs that I didn't think would talk about diversification, now they are, especially in rural Alberta. I think the government of Alberta recognizes that, you know, they have to talk about this type of stuff, especially hydrogen and LNG. I know Premier Kenney himself is extremely passionate about the hydrogen file, which is full strategy will be coming out in spring, so in a couple of months from now, which will be, you know, a combination of ministers working together, including Minister Savage, Minister Schweitzer, Minister Nally, and Kenney, bringing this forward. So I look forward to when this strategy comes forward in the spring. I think it'll be really big for Alberta.
Well, just to build on the comments about hydrogen, you know, the federal government and the provincial governments have both signaled that all stakeholders need to step up. I think the consensus is that we need a hub model to make hydrogen work, not just in Alberta, but in many other places where you have similar sort of geographic situations. In Alberta, you know, the good news is we've got Calgary and Edmonton and a very busy highway in between, but we need the stakeholders to step up, who include those who produce hydrogen engines like Proton, which is a sort of an up and coming company out of Calgary. We've got, you know, big players who can sequester carbon. Shell, and in full disclosure, a client of ours who have their Big Quest project. We need private sector investors. We need regulatory change. So all of these things are covered. So all of that has to happen. And of course, you probably need some support from the federal government and the provincial government to jump in and make all of this cost effective in the first place. So you finally get to that place where you have a critical mass, and then you can see that replicated in other places around the country. So lots of opportunity on hydrogen, but it looks like we still have to wait and see how governments react after this initial foray and set of announcements. And we'll look forward to hearing what Minister Nally says this spring. Michael, comments on Alberta and changes in the direction on energy within the sort of the energy portfolio, away from just oil and gas to oil, natural gas, liquefied natural gas, petrochemicals, the big petrochemical incentive program that's now in place, et cetera.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dad. So yeah, I mean, of course, there's been an enormous amount of conversations on how we diversify, not the economy broadly, of course, but within our energy industries. And you've touched on a few, and Keith did as well. Alberta has enormous natural gas deposits, which are crucial to the development of hydrogen fuel cells, which is going to be a massive part of our energy future. And Alberta is very rich in its ability to harness that energy future. I would like to see more conversations around that, and I think there'll be a lot of opportunity. And just to draw the conversation back to Keystone and some of these other more traditional forms of energy that will still burn significant amounts of GHG through refinement and production. President Biden is going to be inaugurated in a couple of weeks, and he promised that within the first 100 days of his presidency, he'll host a World Climate Summit. So how is Alberta preparing to be part of those conversations in Washington, and with whatever delegates that we are able to send? We have an enormous or a wonderful story to tell here, and our government officials are working diligently to build that story, and they'll have an opportunity to tell it to the world stage, at least that opportunity, but many more to come.
Yeah, and a big shout out to James Rajat, my old colleague, who's now Alberta's representative in Washington, D.C. It's a very good point. On the one hand, Alberta really has to do everything it can to harness the tremendous resources we have. And on the other hand, we're now in a world of net zero 2050, the Great Reset, energy transition, et cetera. And we have to have a good story to tell when it comes to all of that. So let's move on here. We started into this conversation a little bit, and Minister Schweitzer's name has come up a few times. He has, it was an interesting political move to put Minister Schweitzer into this brand new portfolio, portfolio that's pulled together a few different files. And he's really been charged with being a bit of a salesman on Alberta as a technology hub, Alberta as an innovation hub. We're starting to see, a lot of talk about that. As I mentioned, there was some stories about it in the Herald today. We've seen healthcare providers benefit by this. Why don't we get into this a little bit? Matt, you want to sort of say a little bit more about this and maybe talk about the opportunity and how likely it is that Alberta is going to be a big beneficiary of technology and innovation.
So I think right now Alberta's in a position where we have seen growth in our tech sector, not just this year, but over the last number of years. And that momentum, I think, will only be fueled by some of the moves that government has made in recent months. A big one being the Innovation Employment Grant, which kicks in on January 1st and will cover up to 20% of a company's R&D spending. So they're really wanting to see companies come to Alberta, take advantage of our highly educated workforce and our low tax environment, and set up their R&D efforts here. Beyond that, $175 million has been earmarked for the Alberta Enterprise Corporation, and specifically, that will help some of the entrepreneurs and startups in Alberta access capital, expertise, and just other networks within industry. The kinds of things that they need to really grow and to see that sector flourish. So, we've got those kinds of things happening on the home front, but we also have the Invest Alberta agency, which was created to really market Alberta to the world, to tell the story of the low tax environment, some of the regulatory changes that have been made to create a really friendly opportunity for people to come and spend money here in Alberta. And I expect we'll see a lot more of that in the months ahead.
Nothing matters right now like creating jobs. So let's talk about that. Maybe we'll call in Keith here to talk about it somewhat. The tech sector, there's been lots of news about it. Are we ready to start, creating jobs in the kinds of numbers, both in energy and also the new tech sector, to really help turn things around for the government?
Yeah, I think signs are looking good. Like Matt highlighted a couple of these things, which generally when you're talking about a low corporate tax environment, these things are important for companies, but they're not always number one, right? There's a lot of different things that come into decisions, especially around when we're talking about the tech sector. You're talking about access to labor, and tech workers tend to be more interested in livability of a city and things like that. So where Alberta is really competing for, I think the main market we're competing with when it comes to tech is BC. Kelowna, Victoria, Vancouver. We can't compete on things like climate, like literally the weather is better there, and we can't compete on that. But what you can compete on is, again, this low tax environment that does factor in. I'd suggest it's a lot lower on the totem pole in terms of things that are considered by these companies. However, this is why I'm a bit optimistic. Minister Doug Schweitzer and his team, and Minister Glubish to an extent as well, they're all kind of working on all these types of things. They've recognized that when they canceled the innovation tax credits in the fall of 2019, they recognized that it sent the wrong signal to the broader tech sector, because how that was interpreted by the tech sector is you're not welcome here. And I don't think that's the message the government wanted to send, but I think it recognizes that that's how the tech sector perceived it. So I think Minister Schweitzer, he's been very open about this in terms of that he's going to be rolling out a series of initiatives designed for the tech sector, not just not just rehashing the old tax credits. He's looking to other places in Canada and to jurisdictions in the United States, several of which have had good success in incenting diversification, particularly around tech. Look at Texas stealing business from California. Look for those types of things. Look for them to be rolled out quickly. And look for a new message coming from Minister Schweitzer, who's probably the best one to deliver this on behalf of the government, to sell Alberta on these broader diversification items. So I would be optimistic, because I think the government's turning the page on the 2019 sort of brand that didn't send the right message to the broader sector.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Michael, and then we'll go to Sonia. In the meantime, I'm going to go and adjust my blinds, because the sun has come out in Calgary, and now all of a sudden all my lighting that I had set up doesn't work anymore. So Michael, we'll go over to you, and I'm going to disappear for a minute.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, Keith did such a fantastic job at presenting the tenets of what Alberta is trying to do through its tech strategy, through some of its sector-specific strategies to diversify the economy. A buzzword it's almost a buzzword at this point. Governments now, for years, have been trying to move its primary source of revenue away from just traditional oil and gas. The question will be whether or not the Kenney government can do it fast enough to create the types of jobs that they promised in 2019 and create a record that they can be reelected off of in 2023. I think that for me is kind of, aside from the literal jobs and the operations of government that are so important to Albertans, what's interesting to me is the political side of things as we reach the halfway mark of this mandate, of how they're going to take what they've accomplished to date, what they're planning to accomplish, and what they set out to accomplish in 2019, what was interrupted by COVID, and what is still salvageable, or can they do it fast enough? And ultimately, what some of the campaign messaging will be as we reach the halfway point, and both parties will begin to start considering some of those campaign messaging and how ultimately they'll set out to be elected or re-elected.
Well, there's no doubt that everyone is starting to think about all of that. We're 2 years away, 24 months, and a lot closer than that if you think about when campaigning actually starts, probably 18 months out. Everyone will start to look at things like economic records. Sonia, please jump in on this, and then we'll get into a sort of a full-ranging political discussion, and we may end off talking about some other policy matters that are coming up if we have time. But why don't we get into the politics right now? Sonia, please jump in.
Sure. Well, like I said in the beginning, we're at the 2-year mark, and I think Premier Kenney and his caucus are a little anxious to get back into their ridings. They want to hear what people are saying. Especially in rural Alberta, I think people are a bit more passionate about meeting their politicians than the cities. I'm looking forward to seeing what the whole, in terms of the political situation, what the Wexit movement is really going to do to the urban seats. I think in seats like in some of the seats in Edmonton and Calgary, which were won by less than 100 votes or so, I think a lot of the UCP caucus members are a bit anxious about that. It could only take about 100 or so votes to be taken away for them to lose their seats. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the next 2 years will hold.
Okay, and let's see here. We've got some questions coming in. Matt, I'll let you maybe handle some of that. There's some people wondering about agriculture, office space, etc.
Yeah, so one of the questions here is, asking specifically about the agriculture industry and what we can expect in the next year or two. It's referencing some huge changes in tech and also the impact of the increase in carbon pricing on Alberta's farming community. I would say that, this year, Alberta's agriculture sector was one of the few that were able to provide a bit of glimmering hope for the province. It sounds like crop yields by and large were quite significant, and I think after a few years in which flood and fire and all hail and all of these other impacts on our ag community, it's nice to see them have a good year. But in the last few months, we've seen this government invest heavily in Alberta's irrigation districts and in the infrastructure needed to make some of these to make Alberta's farmland much more productive. So they are investing in this sector. We're also seeing some interesting partnerships between, for example, Olds College and some of the growing tech companies in Calgary. So the application of this R&D that government's trying to incent in Alberta will be something to watch if you're working in and around agriculture. But generally, I think the hope is that our ag sector can continue to be one of those sectors that we can rely on for economic growth through the tough times and the good times. We'll be looking forward to seeing, what kind of opportunities come out of some of these government investments in this next year.
Obviously, the federal government doesn't always get along well with Alberta and vice versa, but they are working together on agriculture. There was a big investment through the Canada Infrastructure Bank on irrigation, as you mentioned. And Sonia, that's rural Alberta. Rural Alberta needs some good news. As Matt pointed out, they've had a pretty good crop year, and generally things are going well. The government did identify agriculture, tourism, and oil and gas as their sort of three keystone industries, and then supported by enabling industries like technology, finance, and aviation. But let's talk for a bit about agriculture and especially maybe even the political dimension. Obviously, it doesn't hurt right now to show some love to rural Alberta, especially when a lot of people are talking separation, or there's a significant number of people who are talking about separation. They're mad about some of the restrictions because of the COVID lockdown. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just on ag, it's certainly interesting to see companies like TELUS invest in that sector. Recently, I think with the government, they announced TELUS Ag. I know it's a global initiative, but you can expect to see companies like them partnering with the government and really focusing on that industry. And as Premier Kenney has said before, ag is really going to help with Alberta's economic recovery. I think in 2021 and beyond that, you're going to really see more light shed on that industry, more communications about it, certainly not just in rural Alberta, but perhaps in the cities as well. On the political side of things, I think just with COVID in general, I'm sure, I don't speak for anybody, but I know from the rural Alberta caucus, I'm sure they were probably advocating for a more regional response to the COVID. I believe that's what they were hearing from the constituents. That's certainly not the way. But politically, I think things in Alberta are quite different with the COVID response than nationally, especially with our urban and rural divide. So coming into 2021, I think the government's going to be really challenged with continuing to give more supports to businesses, especially small and medium businesses in rural Alberta that can't afford to put their lights on or have lost revenue, employees, etc. It's going to be a real challenge for Premier Kenney and the caucus to kind of level out the views both from the urban areas and rural Alberta areas. One thing I think we didn't really mention what also is going to happen 2021, it's going to be the referendum, and the Fair Deal panel ideas also being put on that referendum, including probably the equalization formula, section 25 of the Constitution, the police force, having our Alberta pension plan and withdrawing from the Canada pension plan. And I think it would be smart for the government to bring those ideas. I think those are things that rural Alberta is really passionate about and they're concerned about. So the referendum is something I think a lot of people will look forward to.
So there's these are some of the things that Doug Anderson referred to. Some of the discontent in rural Alberta. Keith McLaughlin, you're a avid political watcher. Jump in on the politics, both around some of the divides, rural and urban, but also some of the headway that the New Democrats are making, and your thoughts on what both the New Democrats have to do and on what the government of Alberta has to do in order to be successful in 2021.
Sure. Maybe I'll just build off a little bit of what Sonia had to say when she's talking about the Wexit threat, or the separatist threat that'll probably be on the ballot in 2023 and its effect on urban seats. I think I don't discount. She's right. There will be an effect on urban seats, especially these areas where some UCP MLAs were elected by really narrow margins. I would be less concerned about the Wexit threat from a government perspective if I was the UCP than I would about be alienating the middle. That's going to cost you way more votes in the cities where the battleground, well, Calgary, the battleground will be, than it will anywhere else. Like, I know there's a lot of concern about Wexit in the rural areas, but to me, that just means Minister Nixon wins Rimbey, Rocky House, Sundre with 70% of the vote instead of 85% of the vote. I don't think you're going to see that uptake in the cities as much, and by going too far in terms of getting away from the middle to appease the Wexit voters in the rural, you're alienating the old progressive conservative vote, which went along with the UCP last time, but as you can see in the Calgary kind of polling numbers, it getting much, at least it seems to be getting a lot tighter. That moderate vote is not so happy with some of the direction that the government has taken. So I think that's actually a bigger risk in the city of Calgary. Just quickly, I guess, on what the NDP needs to do, I'll again focus on Calgary, because if you look at the seat math in Alberta, the NDP can be reliably probably anticipated to close to or fully sweep Edmonton, maybe pick up more seats around the Edmonton suburbs, start off with 22 seats or so. Rural Alberta will be swept by the UCP. That's about 30 seats. Really, it's going to come down to Calgary. The NDP would need to win, if it has any legitimate shot of overtaking this government, would need to win at least about 16 to 18 of the 26 seats in Calgary, which sounds pretty crazy given what we've seen in the past. But I guess the one thing I would say for the NDP, you need to continue to talk about the economy. You need to, they were rejected last time, essentially based off of concern that the NDP was responsible, probably a little bit unfairly, obviously, for the economic downturn, and bore that. But you've got to open the door for these voters in Alberta who care about the economy and jobs more than anything. You need to be able to win on those economic issues for them to compete, especially in Calgary, where the next election is going to be won or lost.
Okay, Michael, how do you see things going politically in Alberta in 2021?
Well, I mean, to Keith and Sonia's point, the premier has to stop the bleeding at some point. I mean, he's cratered an enormous amount of support, some of which is to be expected. I mean, honeymoons don't last forever when you are elected. But I think the premier expected his to last longer. He could never have predicted COVID. He couldn't have predicted the price of oil, for that matter, either. With that said, his table has been set, at least for now, and he needs to come up with some solutions here to quickly stop the bleeding and start the recovery of the province. I don't think but I'm a little more optimistic than some, and I'm sure the premier is as well. Sure, he's lost support, though I think it's permanently lost. Of course not. I think the New Democrats have an extremely tall order in front of them, even at the basement that the premier is currently at. I don't think that this is a done deal, despite the numbers and despite the trends of most polls that show the premier continuing to crater support. I think a lot of that lost support is absolutely recoverable. I think some of it is just a kind of a mood switch. People are down. People are, of course, critiquing the government. The economy is poor. Unemployment is high, and there's a public health crisis. And I don't think that support loss as a result is irrecoverable. In fact, I think a lot of it will come back. And to Keith's seat math, he's absolutely correct. The UCP have strongholds all across the rural parts of the province, central Alberta, northern Alberta. Edmonton's really the only place where they're not going to compete all that well. And I'm sure the premier will have something else to say on that. But Calgary will be the battleground, and I think that the premier will start to look at that as such. But do I think he's in campaign mode now? Not even close. And I will never, ever underestimate Jason Kenney. His political machinery and instinct is frankly unparalleled almost by any politician in this country. So I think once he gets back to the normal business of governing, as vaccines come on the horizon and we hopefully beat back this pandemic, I think you'll start to see the UCP numbers recover.
So thank you, Michael. I think there's probably, I would say, I'm going to just put words in everybody's mouth and say we're probably at a consensus that the government's at a bottom right now. Unlikely to go a lot lower, I think. It depends a lot, of course, on economic recovery, and we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to touch on one final issue that is policy related, and that's tourism. My old friend David Goldstein is the new CEO of Travel Alberta. The government has set a tall order. They want to double tourism by 2030. Michael, why don't you jump in and comment on tourism, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Yeah, for sure. To your point, I mean, it's in the mandate letters, or at least instructed to administers and platform commitments to double the tourism industry. That's part of the economic diversification, in my opinion. Minister here will be in charge of doing a lot of that, as will Minister Schweitzer. I mean, we can look to hotel and lodging, the film and television industry. I mean, but I think we have to look at industry, or the tourism industry as a whole. There are a number of subsectors within tourism, but they all play within each other, and they all help each other when the economy is doing well. It's just about making Alberta an attractive place to visit and invest. So from a macro scale, tourism fits in very well.
All right, we're coming up. We've got 2 minutes left. Why don't we just go through things one final time here? We'll go around the table, and if anybody has concluding comments on what they think is important in 2021, now's the time to say them. Matt, let's go to you.
Yeah, I'm really looking towards the October 2021 timeline, when we see what specifically will be on the ballot in terms of referendum questions. I think that, if there are questions about Alberta's role in Confederation and in relation to equalization, I'll be very curious to see what the response is from the federal government to the results of that question, and then from there, where does Premier Kenney go? Because I think that is going to lead to either an acceleration of movements like Wexit, or it could simply just take all of the air out of it, and that would solve a lot of problems for this government.
All right, let's go to Keith McLaughlin. Keith, your thoughts?
Just to build off a couple of things everybody said, 2021 going to be a very interesting year, both politically in Alberta and politically across Canada. Sonia mentioned the fair deal stuff, which is going to be on the municipal ballot. So that those federal provincial tensions are probably going to convalesce right around a federal election. These energy and climate issues, though, they're not going away. You saw Erin O'Toole endorse net zero last week as well, to the chagrin of some of even within the UCP caucus. And then you've got a competitive environment developing provincially here with the NDP and UCP. Mike's right. If the economy improves, you can expect Jason Kenney's poll numbers to improve, and very, very strong. It's going to, things are going to be a bit tougher for the NDP to break through. So it's going to be fascinating to watch how those two, Rachel Notley, Jason Kenney, conduct this next year, and then the federal stage too.
Okay, briefly, Sonia, jump in.
Sure. Thanks, Monty. And just to go off Matt and Keith's point on the Fair Deal panel, I'm really interested to see what Premier Kenney and his caucus will continue to talk about that. The recommendations, I mean, they were extensive. They consulted over several months, had a bunch of their MLAs on that. A lot of those things will be, again, on the referendum in October of 2021. The other thing that I'm going to certainly watch out for is the municipal election coming. I know that's not of a national importance to some people, but I live in Calgary. Nenshi is my mayor. I'm interested to see if he's going to run. We know that in Edmonton, the current mayor, Iverson's not running. Certainly, it's going to be a really busy year in Alberta in 2021 at every single level. So I'm really looking forward to see what's going to happen.
It'll be fascinating. Michael, wrap us up.
Nothing to add.
Okay. Well, we just want to say thanks for letting Mac make some special guest appearances. Probably the most popular member of the panel. Mac,
and the best.
All right. Well, thanks to our panelists. We appreciate that very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Our email addresses are on the New West Public Affairs website. We want to again thank our friends at Earnscliffe for helping organize today, and of course, everyone on the panel. And your appearance fee will be in your stockings, so watch for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas to all, and best wishes for a safe, healthy, and prosperous 2021.